In this video, we're going to talk about ways to monetize your no-code app. How are you going to make money off of it? Now, make sure you stick around until the end because we're also going to talk about the differences between monetizing a web application versus monetizing an app you might put into the app stores, because there is a little bit of a difference. So stick around for that. Now, first, if you're new around here, my name is Kristen, and I'm the co-founder of Coaching No Code Apps, where we help business owners and industry experts build custom apps so they can start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses, all without coding in with no technical background required. So how do you monetize your app? There are lots of different ways you can do this, different monetization methods, pricing models, and a lot of this depends on the type of app you're building, the target market your app will be serving, and really ultimately what your own goals are. So today we're going to break this down and we're going to talk about a lot of different ways to monetize your app. Now, what I'm going to do is share my screen so we can go through this in depth and you can get a full picture on how to make money off of the app that you're building. So what we're going to do is look at a spectrum here. All right. Now, there are lots of different types of apps, right? Different types of apps have different pricing models, have different price ranges. There are lots and lots of factors to consider. So the first thing I want you to understand is just because another app has a certain pricing model doesn't mean that that pricing model is applicable to your own app. So we're going to break down a lot of different details and talk about these different factors so that you can really see where your app is going to fall on this spectrum. Now, on this spectrum, we're looking at a couple different things. So number one, over on the right side, we're looking at more general apps. Okay, these are apps that serve broader markets. They're less niche, less segmented. So they're more general. They apply to more consumers of different varieties, so that they're not as niche. You've used apps like this before, ones where you can be using this app and someone who is your complete opposite could also be using the app. Okay, so we're talking about very general apps. And then over on the other side, we are talking about very niche apps, the most niche apps that you can find. Now, these are apps oftentimes that you don't even know exist because the market they serve is so narrow that you would never even know about it unless you had some relation to that market. And you've probably come across examples of this before where you learn maybe about an industry that you weren't even really familiar with before. And maybe you learn about the different tools and processes that are involved with, businesses or consumers in that industry. Those are the types of apps that we're looking at over here. Okay, so on our spectrum, we're spanning this from this niche type of app to the very general type of app. Now, we're also going to be looking at price point. Okay, so let's say over here, we have free apps. So the most general apps are going to be the free apps. And over here, we have the most expensive apps. And then we'll kind of divide this up here. Okay, so across our spectrum now we have from free apps all the way to, the absolute most expensive. Your average consumer would never even consider paying for an app like this. All right, so that's how we're splitting up our spectrum. Now, we need to look at what types of apps fall into each of these ranges so that you can start to place your app within that same range. And then we're going to talk about common pricing models we see within each of these ranges so that you can see which ones are going to be most applicable to you in that sense. Okay. So when we're looking at the right side of our spectrum here, all right, so everything over here, more often than not, we're looking at more consumer-focused apps. Now, this is not a blanket statement, to be clear, but usually we're looking at more consumer-focused apps. All the way on the right side, we're often looking at apps that you find in the App Store that you download for free, maybe for a small price. That's what we're looking for, or we're looking at rather, over on the right. Now, over on the left is where we generally start to see a shift into the B2B world. Okay, so apps that are geared more so toward businesses. And this makes sense, right? Because for consumers, apps don't necessarily need to be quite as niche, and the average consumer isn't going to spend so much on an app, right? In the B2B world, the apps do need to be more segmented because they need to be serving specific business purposes, and those are naturally going to cost more. Okay, so depending on the type of app you're building, you can start to segment yourself a little bit in terms of price point. Again, this is not a blanket statement, so there can be caveats here. On a general sense, though, this is what you're going to be looking at. Okay, now splitting this up and looking at actual pricing models, you're going to see different models at different price points. Some of these will overlap, but you do see some differentiation between pricing models as you move through this spectrum. So if we look over on the far right side, where we're looking at very general apps that are often free, what we usually see in terms of pricing models are ads or affiliates. Now, remember, we're over on this right side, we're often talking about apps that you might find in the App Store, okay? So that you're going to download on your phone, usually very general. You often see pricing models based around ads because even though the app may be free to download, the company or the founder behind the app still needs to make money some way. And so often running ads is the best way to do this, or working with affiliates, okay? Promoting affiliate products and making money off of those products or off of the sales of those products, for example. So that's what we often see on the very far right side. So if this is the type of app that you're building, these are the general pricing models that you can start to look at, okay? Now, when you move a little bit to the left and you get to the very lowest price point, so where it's not free, but it's still very cheap, right? We're usually looking at subscriptions, okay? So potentially low-cost subscriptions, sometimes freemium apps, okay? So freemium being you can use the app for free, but there are paid features within the app. Potentially, if you want to upgrade or unlock a certain feature set, then you have to pay a little bit beyond the free price point. All right, and then we also see one-time charges. So maybe there's a one-time upfront fee to use the app, and then moving forward, you have access to that ongoing. Now, there can be some merging, like I said. So, if you have a low-cost app, there could be ads on that app, and that could be one of the monetization methods. But generally, there's some separation here. And if your app is going to be very low cost and you're looking at some basic pricing models, or you're wanting to look at some basic pricing models, these are the ones that I would start with. Okay, now, when we reach this very middle point here, right, where we're kind of crossing the barrier into what is generally more B2B, again, this can move a little bit, right, in either direction, but generally that's what we're looking at. Now we're getting to a little bit higher of a price point. This could be, $50 a month. This could be $100, $300 a month, right? So kind of a middle range here in terms of generally B2B apps. Now, when we're looking at these, we're often seeing, again, subscriptions. And subscriptions are obviously a very common pricing model. And so you can see this kind of merging or flowing rather all throughout the spectrum. We're also often going to see tiered pricing models. So instead of a freemium pricing model, for example, over here, where the app is free, but then there are paid upgrades within the app, a tiered pricing model is when there can be a free version, but what we often see is the lowest price point is still paid, but it is at a lower price point. And then there is a next version or a next kind of step up where you have access to more functionality, more features, potentially more service. And so that is on a higher price plan. Then maybe there's another one even on a higher price plan. So it's just a tiered pricing plan where you can kind of appeal to a number of different ranges, but still fall within this section of our spectrum here. Okay, and then we're also often looking at one-time purchases. So if you are looking at an app that provides a service that lets you integrate, basically integrate the app into your own processes, and you're not wanting to charge a subscription, you're wanting to just do a flat one-time fee. We do sometimes see this in this area of the spectrum as well. Now, when you're looking at subscriptions versus one-time, subscriptions are the more common model because subscriptions produce recurring revenue, and recurring revenue enables a lot of flexibility. But I'm adding the one-time charge in here because we do still see this sometimes at this price point, okay? Now, working our way left, when we get to the most niche and the most expensive, this is where we see the most change in terms of pricing models. So sometimes over here, we'll see licensing. Okay, so white labeled apps. If you're building an app where another company can take that app and put their own logo on it and use it to potentially run their own company or some sort of process related to that company, then you could charge a licensing fee, which is usually pretty hefty because your app serves such a fundamental purpose within the business, for example, that the value is there, right? So the price point should be higher. So this is what we sometimes see over on this left side. And again, subscriptions are still going to be common, or sometimes retainers, okay? Now, the reason why I put that here versus subscription, why there's a little bit of a differentiation, is because sometimes when you're looking at this far left side of the spectrum, we're talking about apps where the app is not the only thing being sold. Oftentimes, a consultant or a service-based business offers their own services, but then also offers or decides to build rather an app to complement their services or to somehow supplement those services. And so we see retainer fees sometimes because those apps can be lumped in to that service provider's service package, really. And so we look at it more from a retainer standpoint. Now, really similar to a subscription, but again, I want to make that differentiation because that is something that people do when they're building very niche apps, okay? So we have these different pricing models. We have this spectrum and the price range, and we've kind of split up generally our B2C. So your app going straight to consumers and B2B, your app going to businesses. We've split that up on our spectrum as well. So let me see, what I'm going to do is move this up a little bit so we can have some extra room. Now I want to split this up in another way to help you put yourself in the right section of this spectrum. So in looking at the right side of our spectrum here, again, more B2C focused, more general, lower cost, right? What we are usually seeing as a need for this type of app is, number one, a high volume of users, okay? If you are building an app that's more general and it's at a lower price point, in order for you to monetize the application in a way that is sustainable and that allows you to build a new business, potentially step away from your current job and transition into this, you need a high volume of users, okay? So before you stop and say, hey, I'm going to price my app at X dollars per month, ask yourself, how many users are you going to need in order to reach the goals you have with your application and with this business that you're building, okay? Is that something that you want to pursue, all right? Do you want to go the high volume route where you need to appeal to the masses, or do you want to segment and charge a higher price point and not need as many users? Now, there are pros and cons to this, and what you should look at is your current position. What do you bring to the table with the app you're building? What are your current contacts? What do your current contacts in your industry look like? What knowledge do you have, right? What's your plan for coming into this and rolling it out? Are you just hoping to put the app out there and have, loads of people magically coming to you? Well, if so, then you need to think further into this. How are you actually going to get these people? Okay, so of course, right when you do your first initial launch, you're not going to have a really high volume of users. This is something that will grow over time, just like any business, but it's something that you need to consider when you're deciding how you want to monetize your app. Now, generally on this right side, you're also going to see apps with a lower impact. Okay, so when you're building a more general app that can appeal to tons of different types of people, the app is by default going to have less of an impact on those people's lives. The higher the impact you want to have, the more niche and narrow you need to get, right? That's why we usually do look at more B2B focused apps on the left side, is because the more niche you are, the more pinpointed you can become in solving the problem your app is designed to solve. Therefore, you're going to be able to have a higher impact. Usually with a higher impact, you can charge a higher price, right? With a more general app, you're not going to be solving those problems in as pinpointed of a way. And then by default, your app is going to have a little bit lower of an impact and a little bit lower of a price point. Okay, so that's what we're generally seeing over here. Now, I want to be clear that over on this side of the spectrum on the right, where we're looking at usually what is the free app where they're making money off of ads or affiliates, this is usually where we see apps that are in the App Store. Now, this is not always the case, especially if you've paid for an app that you've downloaded from an app store. This is a general statement. Usually that's the type of app that we're looking at. And that would also fit within these descriptors, right? The high volume, low impact. Can't see that all that well, so I'll remove that. Okay, now looking over at the left side, okay, where we're looking at the more niche apps, higher priced apps, usually the more B2B focused apps. This is where we're looking at the higher value, right? So the value in the solution that you are providing is higher than the opposite side of the spectrum, and the impact is higher, like we've talked about. And because of that, again, you can charge more and have a lower volume of users, okay? So try to fit yourself within this spectrum. Where do you fall? All right, over here, we are actually really the entire left side of the spectrum. We're usually seeing web applications, and even often right here, Okay. So I won't go into web applications versus hybrid apps or native apps. We have another video that deep dives into that. But the reason why I'm saying that here is because sometimes when entrepreneurs come into the no-code space and they've never launched an app-based business before, they don't understand how they might monetize a web application versus an app that you might download from the App Store. And so I want to be clear that lots of different types of apps can fall anywhere on this spectrum. Lots of different pricing models can be applied, and these can all apply to web applications, no matter where on the spectrum they are. Usually, if you're looking at an app that you're going to put into app stores, you're going to fall closer to the right side of the spectrum. Okay, now, if you're building a web app first, you can monetize it still in all of these different ways, or any of these different ways. Don't do all of them, but and you can later still put that into the App Store. So it doesn't have to be free. So I hope that makes sense, right? I don't want to be so specific to where you feel like you can't monetize if you're doing one thing, but I do want to convey the trends and the generalities that we're looking at so that you can simplify the decision of how to price your app, because it holds so many people back, right? Because there's so many options. It's understandable. But the most important thing that I want you to take away is find an area where you feel like you generally fit. And then after you do that, what I want you to remember is to start simple. Okay. So find an area where you generally can put your app right onto the spectrum, and then start simple. Choose a pricing option or a pricing model and start out as simply as you can. I see a lot of entrepreneurs who, maybe they try to start out with a tiered pricing option because their app fits here on the spectrum. And then they have 6 different pricing tiers before they ever have a single user. Try not to do that, okay? If you're going to have a tiered plan, if that's what you're starting with, start with 2 tiers, okay? You don't need any more than that right when you're starting out. And in fact, you shouldn't have more than that, because when you keep it simple from the start, then you can more easily learn what is best for users. Once you learn that, you can expand, you can get fancier, you can get a little bit more complex, but in doing so, you'll know that you're doing it in a way that is best for users. Otherwise, you're just guessing, okay? So put yourself into a general section of this spectrum, find your pricing model, and then keep it simple when you're starting. You can always get fancy later, and naturally you'll continue to evolve and to grow from there. Okay, I hope this is helpful for you. I know that pricing can be a complicated subject, but hopefully this keeps you moving forward with a little bit more clarity and decision making. Now, if you are just starting out with your app or you haven't gotten started yet, you want to make sure you're headed in the right direction so you don't have to backtrack later on. We have a free training over at coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop. It is a 75-minute deep dive training into some of the most core strategy that you need to have in place with your app when you're starting out, so that you can really build early traction, launch sooner, and start scaling sooner. That's what we want for you. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/workshop for that. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.